And we are live here in the Storycraft Cafe. I am your host, Hank Garner, as always. And today I have one of my favorite people on the earth, not just a favorite writer of mine, but a fella that I've loved getting to know over the last few years, Craig Johnson. You probably know him as the author of the Walt Longmire mystery series. And now we're up to 19 books in the series, Craig. Holy cow, how did that happen?
I wish I knew. Like it just seems like I blinked and there were 20 books. Like it's kind of amazing. I don't know. I mean, I guess in some ways, because people ask me about the numbers and all that, and it really doesn't make that much of a connection for me. Like I guess because in many ways, the way I look at the books is it's all just one big book. It's all just one big story,
Yeah.
and for me, it's kind of essential. Like that there be an intertwining aspect, to all the books, that they reconnect, with each other, so that there are parts of the Longmire Defense in the new book that go harken all the way back, to the Cold Dish, the very first book,
Right.
Longmire book that I wrote 20 years ago, and I'm hoping that they'll both connect, to the book that I'm going to write 20 or 30 years from now. I want it to be just a continual tapestry of Walt's life, like it all kind of interconnected, like that, which is kind of explains this book to a certain extent because we kind of circle back around to learn about Walt's grandfather and the relationship that he had with him, and some of these crimes that happened back in the late 40s. And it's kind of interesting for me, like to cover some of that ground again.
Yeah. I'm glad you used the word tapestry because I was thinking in those terms as I started kind of mulling over what, after I read the book and then got to kind of mulling over what we would talk about. And I think anyone who writes a long running series, people tend to think, well, how do you keep coming up with ideas for this character? And really, one thing that I love about the way that you've handled Walt and his whole cast of characters is that it's not a moment in time moving forward. It's not a linear, but you really tell us stories about this character like a tapestry. It's this whole cast of characters, and it's this thing that we learn about has been affected by this thing in the past, will affect things in the future, and it's not a linear thing when you've got this cast of characters like that. Are you constantly thinking in those terms, like, well, Walt is confronted with this. What about his past has prepared him for this, or has prepared him in ill, manner for this, or, do you think in those terms?
Oh, absolutely. Like, and I mean, simply because that's the way we deal with our lives. I mean, it's very
Right.
difficult to live your life and not think about, what it is that's in the past that's informed you, or the things in the future which are going to be a challenge for you. Like, and it was interesting that the term that you used just now, like that, what is the things that have prepared you, for what it
Right.
is you're dealing with here, like that. And one of the main motifs, like that runs all the way through the Longmire Defense is the chess game, that Walt and his grandfather play. I mean, in many ways that's the only place where they could meet on even ground, where they could like look at each other and be on an equal footing. And in many ways, what Walt's grandfather is attempting to do is try and train his grandson how to think, like, past just, reacting to what's happening to you, be able to see what's happening in the next move and the next move and the next move, and be able to play your life one line ahead, which kind of prepares him in many ways to be, the world-class detective that he becomes. He starts being able to see those things before they happen. And also being able to look back and discern what it is that made for this situation. So that's very, very acute. As a matter of fact, you kind of hit the nail on the head as far as that's concerned.
Yeah. And one thing that I love when a new Longmire book comes out is are the titles. Because you love to play with double entendre, and in on the surface, when I first saw the book, I was like, "Oh, what is Walt having to defend himself against?" That's the first reaction, and then you
Right.
start you start realizing that you're maybe talking in chess terms, and then that's a whole other aspect. And throughout the book, you kind of play back and forth with these double entendre, and of course, on the nose, we've got his grandfather teaching him about chess, and there's the Longmire defense. But then there's also Walt is constantly having to, and I don't mean this that Walt is always on the defense, but he holds himself to a higher standard, and I think he does care what people think about him, even if he doesn't come across that way. So there's also this sense of protecting his legacy, if you will, and his familial legacy. When does the title come to you first off?
Well, I mean, it's always like that. You think you have a title, but sometimes it can change because the book
Sure.
changes.
Yeah.
But also in response to what you were saying there too, like that. I mean, for Walt to be defending himself a little bit, like in some ways, Walt is a little bit in the wrong in this
Yeah.
book, because I mean, I like to think of Walt as the most ecumenical, fair-minded, investigator on the face of the earth. He's a very much a believer in innocent until proven guilty. But with that past relationship that he has with his grandfather, it's almost as if he's rooting for his grandfather to be guilty of a most heinous crime like that. That's the investigation of the book. And so it kind of puts him on, thin ice a little bit like that. And it's interesting to see how an awful lot of people in the community who actually knew Lloyd Longmire, the older members of the community like that, maybe knew him a little bit better than Walt knew him. He's constantly having to defend this investigation that he's mounting. And for me, that was fun to put Walt in that kind of a situation because it's not a place that he's been for the last 19 books.
Right, right. Another thing that I love when a new Longmire book comes out is are we going to um are we going to be in Wyoming, or are we going to travel a bit? Is this going to be a, and I read somewhere you had referenced like a professional ball team where you have at home games and travel games, and I was like, that's exactly what you have done with this series. And sometimes we're at home, sometimes we're traveling, but by doing that, you never, it's kind of, if we go back to what we were talking about earlier, the way people think that a book series goes linearly, um but by doing that, you allow us to see things, different things, to see how aspects of Walt's character will play out because of these new characters and new situations. And like the last book, we take a major trip, and you know, and everything that word entails. Um,
Absolutely. Hmm.
how do you start thinking about when it's time for a new book and you're planning that, where the setting is going to take place and how that setting is going to affect the story that you're going to tell?
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right, and of course, you have to look back at the mechanics of this type of thing, like that. Whenever I was starting to write the books, like that, everything in crime fiction at that point in time was very much noir. It was all like gritty, dirty, detectives burying bodies in their backyards, that type of things. And so I thought, okay, well, what if you did the sheriff of the least populated county in the least populated state? That would be something different, wouldn't it? Well, I didn't take into consideration how many people can you kill in the least populated county in the least populated state before it becomes kind
Right.
of ludicrous. Like, and so
Right.
very rapidly, I came to the conclusion that what, Walt's going to have to be like a ball team and like play some away games here,
Yeah.
because and the other thing is like the element for that was that have you ever noticed that in a lot of these novels, the character will do the most amazing job, just crack this incredibly complex case like it, and bring heavy hitters down like that and do this amazing job, and then the next novel comes out and nobody remembers they did that. Well,
Right.
that's not the way it works. Like, it's certainly not in
Yeah.
that form of business. Like, if you develop a reputation as being someone who is extraordinarily capable and extraordinarily able, like to do this, well, then people are going to come knocking on your door. You're going to get some phone calls that say, "Hey, I've got this case that's got me baffled, and I was wondering if you would be willing to come by and maybe take a look at this and see what you could do with it," like that. And so that gave me the opportunity to kind of like move Walt around, geographically, emotionally, intellectually, all those kind of things. And that's kind of important, I think, also in a series, simply because Westerners in the West, that's one thing, but Westerners in the context of, say, Philadelphia, or
Right.
Vietnam in 1968, or, Absaroka County when you're 6 years old. I mean, these are very, very different environs like that. And that can be very informative of the character and tell you things about them that you normally would never come to when they're in their comfort zone and in their usual environs.
It's kind of like the Jessica Fletcher problem, with in Murder She Wrote. How many dead bodies can you stack up in this little town in Maine?
Exactly, and so, and that's why it's also fun, to kind of escape, in different situations, and find different points in Walt's history where we find a crime or a clue to something that happened that was very informative of him. Now, the trick with that, of course, is that if you're going to write one of those type of books, a cold case type book, the key element there is there has to be some sort of modern day connection, or else you're basically writing a research book is what you're doing, and your primary character is going to spend all their time at the library or in front of a computer, or all this, but there's no real threat to them personally, and so I think, with this one, with the financial aspects of the permanent wealth, mineral index fund, that things kind of get a little bit heated when Walt starts discovering things that a lot of people would rather have, swept under the rug and nobody ever find out about.
Right. Well, the one of the things about the things that people love about a small town is the close community, and the fact that your neighbors, and they become like family. And that's also one of the detriments of a small community, is that everybody knows your business and everybody knows everybody's business. And
Absolutely.
and therein lie mysteries, right?
Absolutely, like that, and then the other thing is a lot of people think they know the backstory
Right.
on some of these situations like that, whereas there might have been a little bit more to it than anybody might have suspected.
Yeah.
I mean, one of my favorite scenes in the entire book, is the one where Lucian Connolly, makes Walt stop the truck, and they're standing there, in the median of the highway, having this argument like that about who Walt's grandfather was and why he might have done the things that he did like that, and so it's always interesting to me because you think people when you meet them, but you don't. You don't know
Right.
who they were. You don't know who they're going to become. And so you're dealing with three different people, is what you're dealing with, but you only get the one right now. And so to me, that's always fun to find out and unearth some of that information and see just who they might have been. It might be somebody completely different than what you might have suspected.
Yeah. Well, speaking of those characters, one of the greatest things about this series is this really rich cast of characters that you've created that
Thank you.
surround Walt. And one interesting character that we learn about in this book is this childhood friend, Ruth One Heart. Where did Ruth come from?
Whenever I started developing the idea of this relationship between Walt and his grandfather, and how that there was some sort of mystery to his family, there were things that he did not know, but had been intimated by his grandfather and in his dealings with him. I knew that those things were going to have to come out. We were going to have to find out
Right.
about those things at some point in time. It was just a question of when are we going to get the storyline that's going to give us the ability to believably find out about those things like that, and then how much does anybody know, how much does anybody not know like that, and so for me that was an opportunity to bring Ruthless, as Walt sometimes refers to her, One Heart back into play like that, and there were some things that she knew, about Walt's family that that maybe had not been brought to the surface yet like that, and so that made her a very important character in Walt's history. The other thing is we only get little glimpses of Walt's childhood.
Right.
Um, we've gotten little glimpses of his adulthood, or his experiences in Vietnam, and a lot of other different things like that, but not too much from his childhood like that. And so whenever we find Ruth, she's the one that provides that opportunity to discover what Walt was like, as a child like that. And once again, opportunities to see him in a different environment like that, in a very, very different Walt.
Well, and that's a great way to explore someone's past, is through the relationships of these other characters, because then you get the complexity of, instead of just turning the camera, to them as a child, you're getting to see them through the eyes of someone else and through their perspectives, and then what did their experiences with, how did that affect this person? And then, that more layers to that tapestry we talked about.
Yeah, and it's like I don't know why it is that more authors don't use it like that, but obviously, it's one thing to hear characters sit and talk about their childhood or their relationships or whatever like that, but it's much better and much more graphic, it seems to me, when we actually, it's like when someone tells a good story. If somebody's telling a good story, you're there. You go back in time, like at, or back in a different place or whatever. You are in that place when someone tells you a good story. And so for me, one of the challenges, like in trying to tell the stories, is being able to sweep, the reader up, like and take them back to that point in time, and have it be believable for them, like that they've actually that they're now into that little instance, from the past, and it can be a great deal more revealing, like for them when they read that, I believe.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, when you start a new book, do you have research that you think ahead of time? Okay, I need to learn about this. How does this actually work? And I would imagine this deep into a series, research probably gets a little easier. You probably have cultivated contacts, and how is that working for you? And how do you start thinking about the things that you will need to know before you start the writing?
Oh, I don't know if it gets easier like that because, the research is always different, with each
Yeah,
book. You're always delving into something completely different. Like, and in this book, for me, I was delving into the financial world, which, probably the best indication I can give you of that is when Walt is trying to explain the permanent wealth mineral index fund, to Ruby, his dispatcher. She's looking at him like, you don't even know how to balance your checkbook. What do you know about this stuff like that? And it was interesting to me.
Right.
Like, and I thought, okay, and you don't want to go overboard on this type of thing where you're burying the poor reader with
yeah,
information like that. But to discover that like the state of Wyoming had $80 in the bank in 1968, and that's where they had to come up with the permanent wealth index mineral fund. That was
yeah,
an idea that they borrowed, I think, from Nevada or from Alaska, just to remain solvent like that. That was just an incredible thing for me to take into consideration like that, and then to think, how that fund works, how was it implemented, and how could it possibly be abused, in some ways, like that, which made for that connection for Walt in the modern day, where people are trying to hide not only millions but billions of dollars.
right,
We
right.
and boy, you start talking, what's the old statement? A million here, a million there. And pretty soon you're talking about some serious money. Look at well, you're also talking about a serious threat, for
Yeah,
people who want to, try and keep that kind of information, under the radar.
yeah. Do you ever have times where you learn a piece of information and that spawns a plot point for a book?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Like, I mean, I tend to refer to it as the creek bed method of research, like that. And what I tend to do is I do a ton of reading, like that, for each
yeah,
book, usually about a year in advance, so that when I finish up with all of my research, I'm chomping at the bit, to start writing that book. Like that. But I don't take a lot of notes, So what I tend to do is what I remember is what needs to go in the book. It's kind of a synthesis or a filter, to kind of get rid of a lot of the mass that we really don't need in the book. But whatever it is that sticks in my head, whatever it is that's a component that I think, that's really kind of interesting, like, and that probably needs to be in the book. Okay, well, that's the shiny pebbles that are in the creek bed that you can still see on the surface, and those are the ones that need to go in.
gotcha. We learn a lot about Walt's grandfather, Lloyd, in this book, and it's interesting to get these glimpses of Walt looking back, like we've talked about, but also how that mixes with Walt's relationships going forward. We've got Vic, who we've not talked about this time, but there's always that's always a great source of inspiration and great plot fodder, going forward, while also looking back. It's a really interesting dynamic that we explore in this book. Walt going forward and Walt looking back almost at the same time, and how those two dynamics meet in the present.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. and that relationship, obviously between Walt and Vic, has been, kind of on again, off again, in the back burner
Right.
and the front burner, like that, for what, like, 19 years now, like it. And so, but in all actuality, since I write the books in kind of that Vivaldi, four seasons format, so that it
Right.
takes four books to get through 1 year of Walt's life, like we're actually only 5 years, into their lives, like at this point in time. But even 5 years can be a long time for a relationship to develop like that. So it became time for, some development along those lines. Like, and I think that I was true to that, and I think that the responses were pretty honest too. Like, I don't want to give too much away as far as
Yeah. Yeah.
something like that, but there seem to be some big changes on the horizon with these characters.
Yeah. Um, Another interesting character that shows up in the book, Trisha Knox. Tell me about Trisha and this complicated issue that that arises in the book.
Well, I mean, that's the thing. Like that is that when you live in an area that's kind of known for its tourism, like that, there are an awful lot of people that are rushing to get from the Black Hills over to Yellowstone, like that here in Wyoming, and to do that, they have to go through the Bighorn Mountains, and sometimes that puts them, in contact with the sheriff of Absaroka County, Walt Longmire. And so what that does is it kind of gives Walt an opportunity to respond and react and interact with characters that he may not run into in Absaroka County. It gives him the availability like to stretch himself a little bit. Let's see, you know, where those limitations are as far as how much responsibility he'll take for these different people. And Trisha Knox, like that, with her car going off the road up there, in this search and rescue mission up in the mountains, is also almost one of the catalysts in getting this entire situation and this entire ball rolling in the Longmire defense. But then her situation becomes much, much more complex as the storyline goes on. I could go into more detail about that, like that, but I also don't want to give too much away
Of
as far
course.
as her plot points, in the
Yeah.
storyline, like that. But generally, people don't show up in my books just for no reason at all and then disappear. Generally, they're there for a reason. They're one of those shiny pebbles like that from the creek bed, like that you have to pull out of the water, like polish up.
We've talked in the past, Craig, about how much I loved the Longmire television show that began. Was it? I can't remember what network it was on originally, but it wound up at Netflix.
It was on A&E for the first three
A&E.
seasons, and then
That was
switched
on the tip of
over.
my tongue, and I couldn't say it. And I try to for people that have not seen the show or not read the books or one or the other, I try to tell them that they are connected but not the same.
Mhm,
They should be taken each for what they are. They're very connected, and I feel like the TV show was very true to the books,
mhm.
but not always, and not in a bad way, but just different. And the television show should be taken as a whole single thing. I feel like it's a complete story arc, and it's satisfying to the end.
Oh, absolutely. It's an entity unto itself. It's the way
Yes.
I describe it is two separate but equal universes.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
kind of difficult, in a 42-page teleplay. I mean, one of the first meetings that I had with the producers, they said, "Your books don't break down into a 42-page teleplay." And I was like, "Thank goodness
Right.
they did. You
Thank
should
you.
be reading them for goodness sake." Like, and so, I think, what they did was kind of cherry pick, and go through and
Yeah.
take bits and pieces, from all the different books, like, and then come up with their own storylines, like for that 42-minute format, which is perfectly reasonable. And yeah, I think you're absolutely right. They stay very, very true to the tone, to the feel, and everything of the books. But I think in many ways, they also did me a miraculous favor by not slavishly following the books. Because whenever someone comes up to me and says, "Well, I would read the books, but I don't have to because I've seen the TV show," and I'm like,
Right.
"Well, in all actuality, you've only scratched the surface, of the iceberg. You need to go ahead and dive into the books. If you really love these
Absolutely.
characters in this world, jump in there like that and discover a whole new world, as a matter of fact."
Yeah. Is there any temptation to go back to the screen with Walt and company?
Oh yeah, I mean, we're here. We're 6 years after they completed production of the last season, sixth season, and we're still one of the top 10 to 20 shows on Netflix every
It's
other week.
amazing.
And
It is
so the,
amazing.
the the show seems to have like a longevity like that. That I don't know if Netflix or Warner Brothers actually thought that that was going to happen. But we're consistently hearing the stories about the potential for television movies, more episodes and that type of thing like that. And I know that the actors are fully in favor of like attempting
Yeah,
to resurrect like that. And so it may take a while for Warner Brothers to come around to that.
sure.
There's nothing that big corporations love better than making money by not doing nothing like that. That's what they
Right.
love more than anything.
Right.
So we'll see what happens like that.
Yeah.
So,
Well, the cast was absolutely perfect, so I hope that all that remains the same, if possible. We're talking about
well, I'm not going
wishes
to be the
here,
one to
so
tell them they can't get in it again. I'm not going to be the one to tell them that like that because
right,
they've been
right.
pretty adamant about wanting to get back in there and doing it again.
So the new book, the Longmire Defense, number 19 in the Longmire series, 20 is a big number coming up. Craig, have you started thinking about book 20, and are you in the process yet?
I actually already turned that one in like that. I actually finished the first draft and actually turned it in like that just before because I generally don't get those done like that before I go out on tour like that. But this one,
Yeah.
wrote very very quickly like that, and it's called First Frost is the title like that, and where the title comes from is like whenever cowboys switch over from their straw hats over to their wool hats, like it's the first frost.
Right.
And what's happening in this particular book is the entirety of the book almost takes place back in 1963. And what happens is Walt and Henry graduate from college and lose their deferment like that and are drafted, into the military for the Vietnam War. And so Henry has to report to Fort Polk, Louisiana, and Walt has to report to Paris Island off South Carolina, like that. So it leads to this epic Route 66 road trip for two 22-year-old Walt's and Henry's. And the question is, how far do they get before they get into trouble? And the answer is not very far at all.
Not very far, as we would expect. Well, I, what a perfect way to cap 20 in a series than that. Um, Craig, you love being from Ucross, Wyoming, and your Twitter handle even is Ucross Pop 25, if I remember right.
You're right. You're
And
absolutely right.
for forever, the population has been Ucross Population 25. Well, I recently saw that it's now listed as Population 26.
We have jumped like at by one person like that. And personally, I think it's a scam like that because I think it's just a way of the state of Wyoming to get some more money out of the federal government. If you have enough of a percentage of municipalities that go up in population, I think they get a little bit more money from the federal government. And as soon as they decided after 40 years that Ucross could go up by one, it set off a fervor here in Ucross. Everybody was running around trying to figure out who had a baby, who moved in, what happened. As near as we can tell, nothing like that. There's been absolutely no increase whatsoever, but we're now officially 26 like that. So I don't know. Population's growing, and I don't know. Maybe it's going to be too big, and I'll have to go move somewhere else.
That's hilarious. That's hilarious. The Longmire Defense comes out September 5th, which is when we're recording this. That's next Tuesday. If you're listening to this on the podcast channel, it will. You can go to your local bookstore and go grab it today. We'll also put links to it where you can grab it from Amazon. Craig, always a pleasure to catch up. Book 19, Longmire Defense, amazing. Can't wait for book 20. Thank you, buddy.
Thank you, sir.